All right. Well, welcome everyone to our webinar this afternoon on the moratorium on rent increases, which has recently been passed by our City Council. So the way our webinar will be working today is we're going to be sharing a presentation, and Vivian Nguyen from my team is going to be sharing her screen so that you can see the presentation as we follow along. And my staff, Lupe and Vivian, they're both going to be available to monitor any questions that you have throughout the webinar. So if you have any questions, go ahead and enter them. You can type them into the question and answer box. They will be monitoring the box, and after I conclude my portion of the presentation, we will be answering some of the questions that you have. Additionally, if you're joining us by phone, please go ahead and enter your questions. Email them to rsp@sanjoseca.gov. And we can respond to your questions by email following the webinar. Let's see. I think that's about all we have to go over before we can get started. So, okay, great. So Vivian is sharing the presentation now. So hopefully those of you who are logged into the Zoom webinar can see the slides in front of you. So, all right, so I wanted to just give a little bit of background on where this moratorium started. So on April 14, the City Council approved an extension of the eviction moratorium. And at that time, they directed the city attorney and city staff to return to City Council with a draft ordinance implementing a temporary moratorium on rent increases. The moratorium on rent increases accomplishes several goals for the city. So first, it is to stabilize housing. Second, to decrease homelessness by helping mitigate a tenant's potentially insurmountable debt obligation after under the eviction moratorium period and when that's lifted. And also maintaining that landlords can achieve a fair return on their rental property. So those are all of the different goals of this moratorium. All right, next slide, please. So landlords and mobile home owners are facing financial insecurity as tenants have not been able to pay rent in April and some in May as well. And it is unclear how deep and widespread the economic impacts will be on the rental housing market. At the same time, residents continue to receive rent increases, and for families already facing economic hardship, these rent increases will accumulate and may be facing eviction if they're unable to pay the accumulated debt in the end to their landlord. The moratorium on rent increases applies to apartments covered by the apartment rent ordinance and mobile homes covered by the mobile home rent ordinance. The moratorium on rent increases prohibits that landlords for apartment rent ordinance properties and park owners for presiding over mobile home parks. It doesn't allow them to increase rents from April 20th through December 31st. It also allows landlords for apartment rent ordinance properties or mobile home park owners to file a fair return petition. And any increases resulting from an increase in rent under a fair return are allowable under the moratorium on rent increases. So I wanted to provide an example of how the moratorium works. So in this case, just imagine for me that a tenant was paying $2,000 in rent, in their normal rent. So in the first case, what happened is in March, they were paying $2,000. In April, their landlord provided them a 5% rent increase for the increase in being $100. So their new April rent was $2,100. And what happened is the moratorium on rent increases was not retroactive. So any April rent increases that went into place remain in place. So what this means is that the rent will remain at $2,100 through the term of the moratorium, and it will not be impacted by this action. Now, a second scenario is that a tenant was paying $2,000 and their landlord was proposing a rent increase on May 1st. Now, in this case, the rent moratorium went into place on April 29th. Therefore, there was no rent increase allowed on May 1st. So the rent increase amount was $0 due to the moratorium, and the rents that will be paid for this tenant through December remains $2,000. The moratorium on increases also includes a provision allowing for temporary reductions in rent. The purpose of this provision is to incentivize landlords to work with their tenants to reach a mutually beneficial agreement while allowing the landlord to restore rents to their original contract rate without being limited by the annual general increase. So I want to provide an example of this situation as well. And again, this is really, this was added to the moratorium because we have been talking to landlords throughout our community who are trying to reduce rents right now. In response to the COVID-19 crisis, there are landlords who want to negotiate rents with their tenants and are eager to go ahead and lower the rents. So what we wanted to do was create a provision to make this work out for all the parties as intended. So in this example, if the contract rent for July was $2,000 and the tenant and the landlord agree to a $500 rent reduction to take the rent down to $1,500, that is allowable, and the rent can actually return back up to the $2,000 rate during the period of the moratorium without the landlord being limited to the 5% rent increase. Because the $500, if you go from $1,500 back up to $2,000, that is a rent increase that will exceed 5%. So this is a special circumstance where increasing the rents back to where they were is allowable. The agreement must be in place, and the rents need to be adjusted back up to where they came during the period of the rent increase moratorium, which again goes through December 31st. So if the agreement was to reduce rents down to the $1,500 and the rents are not returned back up to $2,000 by December 31st, then future rent increases will be limited by the 5% amount. The ordinance also provides some additional provisions that I wanted to go over with you. The ordinance precludes service reduction claims based on the closure or elimination of recreational common areas that resulted from closure orders that came from the county public health orders. So, for example, if a landlord closed a clubhouse or a community space that is typically available to tenants and residents during this period, tenants are not allowed to file a petition for that specific reason during the moratorium. Additionally, late fees on outstanding rent stabilization program fees will be suspended for not only the current year, which we're in right now, but also for the coming year. So the suspension of late fees will extend into fiscal year 2021. And finally, there is a waiver of building permit application fees for all buildings covered by the apartment rent ordinance that are looking to move forward with maintenance of those apartments. So all of those permit application fees will be waived during the term of the moratorium. So as we were going through our review of the moratorium on rent increases and the apartment rent ordinance and the mobile home rent ordinance, what became very clear to our team is that there are just different aspects within the mobile home rent ordinance that are different, and actually the way that these laws interact apply differently in mobile homes. And so what the city council approved was an alternative concept where a rent increase may actually be noticed and served by a park owner to mobile home residents. However, that rent increase may not be collected during the period of the moratorium. So why don't you go ahead to the next slide, and I'll provide an example. So in this case, if a space rent for a mobile home is $1,500 and there was a proposed rent increase, which is 3% under the ordinance for May of $45.15, the park owner may actually include on the bill that's provided to the resident for space rent, they can include $1,500 and then an additional $45.15 for May, as long as it also has a credit for $45.15 for the month of May. So the concept is that these rent increases may be served, but a rent credit must also accompany the rent increase. And that credit will run for the term of the moratorium on rent increases. So as the moratorium lifts on December 31st, then the rents for mobile home for this mobile home owner in January will then become $1,545.15. So the first time that the resident will actually be paying the rent increase will be in January. And then moving forward, there in the way that rent increases work in mobile home parks is that they have the whole park has a anniversary date where their rent is increased on the same day for the whole park each year. And in this example, the anniversary date is in May. And so what will happen is that in the coming May 2021, the park owners may move forward again with their annual rent increase. So I just want to be clear that there are some differences between the apartments and mobile homes, and this is the most significant difference for us to all understand. So I just wanted to let everyone know that more information is available on our website regarding this. And what we've done is actually created a page on the Housing Department's website, which you can find at sanjosehousing.gov, sanjoseca.gov/housing. And what you can find there is COVID-19 resources. So we have set up special web pages just to provide information to the public regarding all of the changes that have taken place under COVID-19. So you can find our eviction moratorium page where we talk all about the eviction moratorium. There's lots of information there. And now we have a new site for our rent increase moratorium. So both of these are available and full of information for anyone who wants to learn more about this. Next slide. So that concludes my presentation portion of our webinar today. And what I would like to do now is just to have, again, anyone who has any questions, go ahead and enter your questions into the Q&A box, which is located on the bar on the bottom of your screen. If you roll over it, it says Q&A. So you can actually enter your question there, and then Vivian and Lupe will help organize those questions. Ask those questions to me. I will respond so that everyone can benefit from that. And again, if you're on the phone, we realize that you don't have the ability to type in, but you can go ahead and email us at rsp@sanjoseca.gov, and then we'll reply to your question via email. So with that, Vivian or Lupe, do you have any questions you'd like to bring to the group?
Hi, Rachel. This is Lupe, and yes, one of the questions is, I'm going to rephrase it just a little. Why did City Council not make the moratorium on rent increases retroactive?
Oh, okay, that's a great question. So, to provide a little more context on this issue, when the City Council considered the moratorium on rent increases, they actually had multiple versions of the ordinance to consider. And one version of the ordinance included retroactivity to April 1st, and one version did not. So, so what the City Council had to do was to decide which one they wanted to move forward with. It really was a policy decision. And so I would just say that, well, clearly the City Council voted to move the ordinance forward that did not include retroactivity. Why they did that, it's a little bit hard to say what they were thinking, but I would just say, based on the discussion, there were some council members who felt like the retroactivity was problematic and just a little harder to deal with in practical life. What do you do about those? You know, how do you roll rents back, and how does that all work? It really raised questions for them that they didn't really feel like were absolutely necessary to explore at this time. So I would just say they just felt more comfortable that the solid way to move forward was a moratorium on rent increases that was effective the day they approved it, so that there wasn't any question about how the retroactivity would work and all of that. So again, they had both options, and it was their policy decision to move forward with a version without retroactivity.
Great, thank you. I'm going to rephrase this one as well, but can you go ahead and share once more exactly what units the eviction or the moratorium on rent increases applies to, and what units the eviction moratorium applies to?
Okay, great question. So the moratorium on rent increases is more limited. It's a more narrow focus versus the eviction moratorium. So I'll get into that. So the moratorium on rent increases only applies to apartments that are covered by the apartment rent ordinance. And the definition for those units is any apartment building that has 3 units or more that was built before 1979, or well, okay, so that's one group. Then the additional group is mobile homes that are covered by the mobile home rent ordinance. And in that case, that means a mobile home park that was also built and had building permits issued prior to 1979. So that is the scope of our moratorium on rent increases. The scope for the eviction moratorium is more broad. The eviction moratorium applies to any rental agreement in the city of San Jose that is in existence. So it may be someone who is renting a room in a home. It would be someone who's renting a single family home, a duplex, a condo, an apartment that was built after 1979, and all mobile homes. So the eviction moratorium, the eviction protections are more broad and cover a wider range of residents. And again, just to clarify the reasoning, the moratorium on rent increases is actually a form of controlling pricing for rental units, and that is something that can only be done legally to units or housing, housing that's provided under the apartment rent ordinance or the mobile home rent ordinance, because there is other state law that does not allow the city to extend the rent control provisions to those other units.
Thank you. So we do have another question, Rachel. Can you please explain the fair return aspect that you mentioned, the fair return aspect for landlords that you mentioned earlier?
Okay, sure. So under both the apartment rent ordinance and the mobile home rent ordinance, a landlord is basically must be able to provide a fair return or receive a fair return under these ordinances. So what's involved if a landlord or a park owner is interested in filing a fair return? We have information on our website that has all of the forms and everything, but essentially it's a full financial analysis of all of the expenses and the income for the specific property. And if it is determined that the net operating income for the property is not met because of the limitations that are created by the limitations on rent increases, then there's a calculation done, and a landlord may actually seek to raise rents in order to achieve a fair return.
Thank you. One other question. Does the moratorium apply to Section 8 housing?
Oh, that's a good question as well. The moratorium on rent increases, let's see, it would not apply to Section 8. I was just trying to think of an example where someone is living in a rent stabilized apartment, because this is we run into this all the time. So there may be someone who has a portable Section 8 voucher, and they have that voucher and they're living in an apartment that is covered by the apartment rent ordinance. However, in those cases, still, the Section 8 program is really what oversees the rent increases. And this moratorium on rent increases will not be able to interfere or limit the ability for a property owner to raise rents as long as it complies with the Section 8 guidelines.
Great. Does the housing department have a form letter or informational brochure so landlords can use that information to communicate to their tenants?
Well, that's a great question. For the we are working on developing resources right now for the community regarding the moratorium on rent increases. So we have some things available on our website right now. We have different resources there, and we are currently developing other things. So I would just say, if we don't have something posted right now, we will, by the end of the week, have additional information available for both landlords and tenants so that they can understand the provisions of the moratorium on rent increases.
All right, so far those are the main questions we have right now.
All right. So if anyone has any other questions, go ahead and enter those questions now. Otherwise, yeah.
Rachel, there's another question regarding what is the difference between the rent freeze that City Council had initially discussed versus the moratorium on rent increases?
Okay, that is a very good question. So so a few weeks ago, two of the council members brought forward a recommendation to have a 90-day period. I think it was 90 days. Anyway, but a period of time where there was a rent freeze where people did not have to pay rent. And that was something that was determined by our city attorney's office to not be a legal like legislative piece. So we can't bring forward, it was determined by the city attorney's office that it is not legal to bring forward a law that says for any period of time, if it's 30, 60, or 90 days, that tenants do not need to pay rent. That is something that is not lawful. However, at the same time, the attorney's office pointed out that it would be lawful in the certain circumstances of the apartment rent ordinance and the mobile home rent ordinance to bring forward an ordinance that said rent may not be increased. So just the incremental change in rent, that is something that we have the authority and the powers under the current law for us to bring forward. So that really is the difference between the concept that was brought forward initially, which was to not pay rent at all, versus this new concept, which is not being allowed to increase rents. All right, are there any other questions? Oh, and you know what? I do want to just add to that that explanation that the city attorney's office at the time that the request was brought forward to have tenants not pay rent, they did issue a memorandum that summarized their legal opinion about that. And that same memo also included the concept of limiting rent increases and stated that that would be lawful. So that memo is available and is posted on the city council website, where you can go to the agendas and review the agendas. The memo provided by the city attorney's office is available there if anyone would like to review that. Well, let's see, Lupe or Vivian, do you see any additional questions that we should address at this time?
Those are all the main questions so far.
Okay.
Just another one kind of repeating back regarding the takings potentially in that memo. So hopefully, or maybe we can just share that link to that memo to explain what the city attorney's office analysis was.
Yes, that would be helpful. We can also provide that on our a link to that memo on our website under the moratorium on rent increases. I think that's really kind of where it goes. So we can provide a link to that memo there, because that's really where the concept was born out of this whole discussion of that was brought forward by the city council on that date. So we can provide that on our website to make it a little easier to find.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And just some general, just a point of information, are we going to be able to provide a copy of these slides or this presentation?
Yes, so we are actually recording this presentation, and so our plan is that we will, within the next day or so, we will make this presentation available on our website, on our Moratorium on Rent Increases webpage. All right. Well, with that, I just want to thank all of you for your time today and for your participation in our webinar today. And thank you again. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.